Garrett McKinley's hands were rough and calloused as he picked up the old cardboard box from the attic at Dusty Corner. After 20 years of military service, his body was tough, but nothing could have prepared him for the memories this simple task would bring up. He sat down on the creaky floorboards. Legs and pried open the box's flaps. A musty scent wafted up, carrying with it the ghosts of a past he tried so hard to bury inside. Lay a jumble of mementos, deployment photos, old letters. Garrett's breath caught in his throat. A small blue baby booty peeked out from beneath a stack of papers. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against the soft fabric. He was instantly transported back to that day 20 years ago when his world had shattered. "I'm so sorry," Garrett said, his voice crackling through the satellite phone, choked with sobs. He felt it disappear beneath his feet. He gripped the phone tighter, willing his wife's words to be untrue. He managed to get his own voice barely above a whisper out. He told her how it just happened. Eliza cried. She said she woke up and there was so much blood. She said she was sorry. She said she was so sorry. Garrett blinked away the memory. His jaw was clenched tight. He and Eliza had never fully, even after all this time, 2 decades later, he could still feel the invisible wall between them, a barrier built of shared grief and unspoken words. He put the box aside and looked at a manila folder tucked into the box's corner. He was curious, so he pulled it out. The tab was blank, but the folder's contents spilled out as he opened it, revealing a stack of official-looking documents. Garrett's eyes widened as he scanned the first page. Adoption papers. He muttered. Confusion. His brow furrowed as he read further. His heart began to race. The child's name was Savannah, and his own name was listed as the father. The date matched perfectly with his deployment. Garrett breathed, shaking his head in disbelief. He thought, "This can't be right." But as he looked over the documents, the truth became undeniable. The child he and Eliza had mourned for 20 years hadn't died, she'd been given away. Garrett's mind reeled. How could Eliza have done this? Why would she lie about losing their baby? He couldn't stop thinking about it. He was filled with a burning sense of betrayal as he gathered the papers with shaking hands and made his way down the attic stairs. His footsteps were heavy with purpose as he made his way to the kitchen, where he found Eliza humming softly as she prepared dinner. The domestic scene before him, his wife of 25 years, suddenly felt like a lie. Eliza Garrett's voice was low and controlled as she turned a smile on her face, which quickly faded when she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Garrett held up the folder. "What is this?" Eliza's face strained of color as she reached for the counter to steady herself, her eyes fixed on the documents in Garrett's hand. "Where did you find that?" she whispered in the attic. "I see now," Garrett replied. "Answer my question. What the hell is this?" Eliza's lips trembled as she struggled to form words. "I can explain," she began. Garrett's voice rose. The careful control slipping, she tried to explain how her child, the one you told me died, is actually alive. "How did you give her away without even telling me?" Tears welled in Leah's eyes. "I was scared, Garrett. You were gone and I was alone. I didn't know how to raise a child by myself. I thought it was for the best." Garrett slammed the folder onto the kitchen island, making Eliza flinch. "You lied to me for 20 years. He snarled. "Eliza, you let me believe our child was dead." "I'm sorry," Eliza said, sobbing and reaching for him. "I was young and stupid. I didn't know what else to do." Garrett recoiled from her, his face showing disgust. "Don't you dare try to justify this," he said. He turned away, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. Eliza's betrayal was overwhelming. Every memory of their life together now felt tainted and poisoned by this monumental lie. "What's her name?" Garrett asked suddenly, his back still to Eliza. "WBY, what he said, his eyes blazing. "Our daughter's name is Savannah," Eliza replied, hesitating before answering. "Savannah," Garrett nodded slowly. The name settled into his heart like a physical weight. "Savannah," he repeated softly, then with renewed anger. Where is she now? I don't know, Eliza admitted, her hands wringing. The adoption was closed. I haven't tried to find her. The admission hit Garrett like a punch to the gut. Not only had Eliza given their child away, but she'd never even attempted to locate her. He'd even tried to find her, but spent 20 years mourning a ghost while his daughter had been out there living and breathing, completely unaware of his existence. Get out, Garrett growled, his voice dangerously low. Eliza's eyes widened in shock. What I said, get out, Garrett roared, causing Eliza to stumble backward. I can't even look at you. Right now, just go. Tears were streaming down her face. Eliza grabbed her purse and left the house. The front door slammed, and Garrett was left alone with the weight of his newfound knowledge. He sank into a kitchen chair, his head in his hands. His logical brain knew he needed more information. But he was overwhelmed by emotion, rage, betrayal, and a deep, aching loss. He felt a kind of emptiness inside. After what felt like hours, Garrett lifted his head. His eyes were dry, his expression set. He knew what he had to do next. The following morning, Garrett sat across from Logan Abrams in a dimly lit office. The private investigator's reputation preceded him. Logan, you're a military man like Garrett, with a knack for uncovering even the most deeply buried secrets. Let me get this straight. Garrett's wife told him their child died 20 years ago, but he just found out she was actually given up for adoption. That's right. I need to know everything. Where is she? What has her life been like? And why did my wife really give her up? Logan said, pulling out a notepad. I'll need all the information you have, dates, names, anything that might help track down your daughter and piece together what really happened. SP spent the next hour providing Logan with every detail he could remember. As he spoke, he felt a mix of hope and dread. Part of him longed to find Savannah to see the woman his little girl had become, but another part feared what other secrets might be unearthed in the process. I'll get started right away, Logan said. Sure him as Garrett was about to leave, but Garrett, are you sure you want to open this can of worms? Sometimes the truth can be more painful than not knowing. Garrett paused at the door, his hand on the knob, and turned back to Logan. His eyes were hard with determination. I've lived with a liar for 20 years, Logan. Whatever the truth is, I need to know it. Weeks passed in a haze of tense silences and sleepless nights. Garrett and Eliza moved through their home like ghosts, avoiding each other's gazes and speaking only when absolutely necessary. Eliza had tried. Garrett had asked her several times to explain, but she'd been shut down each time. He wasn't ready to hear her excuses. He wanted to know everything before he made up his mind. When Logan finally called, Garrett's heart was in his throat. He arranged to meet the investigator immediately, leaving Eliza with nothing more than a curt, I'm going out back in Logan's office, Garrett said. His palms were sweaty as he waited for the investigator to speak. Logan's expression was grim as he pulled out a file. I found her, Logan began, sliding a photograph across the desk. Garrett's eyes widened as he looked at the image of a young woman with his eyes and Eliza's smile. He was taken aback when he saw the photo of a young woman with his eyes and Eliza's smile. Savannah, he said, tracing her face with a trembling finger. Logan corrected gently, actually, her name is Brielle Hastings. She's 20 years old and lives in upstate New York. She's had a good life, with loving adoptive parents and a good education. Garrett nodded, taking in every detail of his daughter's face. But there was something in Logan's tone that made him look up. What aren't you telling me? Logan sighed heavily. Garrett, there's no easy way to say this. Brielle, Garrett was taken aback. He hadn't realized that Brielle wasn't his biological daughter. The adoption papers had been falsified. Logan continued, the DNA records, medical histories, Belle's biological father is a man named Chase Winfield. Garrett felt as though he'd been punched in the gut. Chase Winfield. He repeated the name, tasting bitter on his tongue. Logan nodded solemnly. He was a real estate developer. He was in town around the time Eliza would have. I'm sorry, Garrett, but it seems your wife had an affair while you were away. The news hit Garrett like a tidal wave, sweeping away the last remnants of the life he thought he knew. Eliza hadn't just given away their child, she'd given away another man's. And let Garrett believe it was his own child. 20 years. Garrett muttered, his voice low. 20 years of grieving a child that was never mine. 20 years of comforting my wife over a loss that was nothing but a lie. Logan reached out, placing a hand on Garrett's shoulder in a gesture of sympathy. Garrett's eyes hardened with cold fury. All the pain, all the grief, all the lost years crystallized into a single burning desire. He said, his voice low and dangerous, "Now I want the truth and then I want justice." As he left, he added, "I want it all." Logan's office. Logan was holding a photograph of Brielle. Garrett's mind was already racing. The shock was giving way to a calculated rage. Eliza had stolen more than just a child from him. She'd stolen 20 years of his life. That was built on a foundation of lies. Garrett got in his car. He stared at Brielle's smiling face one more time. Then he tucked the photo away. A plan was already forming in his mind. Eliza would pay for her betrayal. But not just with a simple divorce was out of the question. Garrett would make sure she lost everything, just as he had, as he drove home. His expression was one of grim determination. The man who had entered Logan's office was gone, replaced by someone harder and colder. He would stop at nothing to reclaim what was taken from him and make those responsible suffer. The war had just begun, and Garrett McKinley was prepared to do whatever it took to win. Garrett stood in his study, surrounded by a growing stack of information papers covered every surface. Each one was a piece of the puzzle he was determined to solve. His eyes were rimmed with dark circles from sleepless nights spent scanning financial records, old letters and emails he managed to recover from Eliza's accounts. A knock at the door interrupted his concentration. Garrett's voice called softly from the other side of the door. "Can we talk?" He clenched his jaw, considering ignoring her. But no, he needed to maintain the facade. "Just a little longer." "Come in," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Eliza entered, her eyes widening at the chaos of papers. "What is all this?" Garrett forced a weary smile. "I'm just trying to make sense of things. You know how I get when I'm processing." She nodded, her hands wringing nervously. "I was hoping we could discuss everything I know. You're angry and you have every right to be, but I want to explain." He interrupted, his tone sharp. "How exactly?" "You cheated on me while I was deployed. You gave away a child that wasn't even mine and let me believe she was dead for 20 years. Eliza flinched at his words. "I was young and scared, Garrett. I've regretted it every day since." Garrett laughed bitterly. "A mistake? Is that what you call 2 decades of lies? Please, Eliza. I love you. We can work through this. We can go to counseling. We can try to rebuild." "Rebuild?" Garrett's voice was dangerously low. "You want to rebuild on a foundation of lies?" Eliza stepped closer, reaching for his hand. "I know I hurt you, but we've been through so much together. Doesn't that count for anything?" Garrett allowed her to take his hand, even as revulsion churned in his stomach. He needed her to believe there was hope. It would make his revenge all the sweeter. He softened his expression, letting out a long sigh. "I don't know, Eliza," he said, his voice deliberately conflicted. "This isn't something I can just get over, but maybe you're right. Maybe we should try counseling." Hope blossomed in Eliza's eyes. "Oh, Garrett, thank you. I promise I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Garrett nodded, squeezing her hand. "It won't be easy, but we can try." Eliza left the room, a small smile on her face. Garrett's expression hardened once more. He turned back to his papers, his determination evident. He decided to play the field for a while and let her believe they had a chance, all while setting the stage for her ultimate downfall. Weeks passed as Garrett continued his careful planning. He moved their savings into separate accounts, secured their most valuable assets in his name, and began quietly spreading the truth to those closest to them. All the while, he maintained a careful facade of a husband trying to work through a difficult time. One evening, as they were getting ready for bed, Eliza brought up the subject of their estranged daughter. "Have you thought about trying to find her?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Garrett paused, considering his words carefully. "I have," he admitted, "but I'm not sure it's the right thing to do. She has her own life now." Eliza nodded, her expression clearly relieved. "Maybe it's best to leave the past in the past." Garrett bit back a harsh laugh. If only she knew what he had planned. Maybe, he agreed noncommittally. Garrett found himself in upstate New York the next day, watching Brielle Hastings go about her day from a distance. She was beautiful, he thought, a perfect blend of Eliza and the man she betrayed him with. The sight of her stirred a complex mix of emotions: anger, loss, and a strange sense of connection despite knowing she wasn't truly his. As he observed Belle's interactions with her adoptive parents, Garrett felt a pang of realization. They seemed like good people, providing the love and stability he might not have been able to offer had he raised her. They seemed like good people, providing the love and stability he might not have been able to offer had he raised her. For a moment, he had doubts, wondering if he was doing the right thing. But then he remembered the lies and the years of grief over a child that was never his. His resolve hardened once more. Eliza's betrayal went beyond just the affair and the adoption. She had robbed him of the chance to be a father and the opportunity to love this child, regardless of her. Parentage. Garrett's phone buzzed with a text from Eliza. She was thinking of having a dinner party next week. "What do you think?" He smiled grimly. This was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. "Sounds great," he replied. "Invite everyone." The night of the dinner party arrived. The McKinley home filled with the chatter of their closest friends and family. Garrett played the role of the gracious host perfectly. All the while, he watched Eliza flit about nervously. She was clearly hoping this dinner party was going to help them patch things up, especially as the main course was served. Garrett stood up and tapped his glass to get people's attention. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. Eliza looked up at him, hope shining in her eyes. Garrett met her gaze and allowed a small smile to play at his lips before turning to address their guests. 20 years ago, I was deployed overseas when I received devastating news," he began. "My wife. I was called to say our child had died." There was a sympathetic murmur through the room. Eliza's smile faltered slightly, confusion creeping into her expression. "It was a pain unlike anything I'd ever experienced. We grieved that loss for 2 decades. Recently, though, I discovered something extraordinary. I lost Garrett," she said, her voice hard. "I was given away without my knowledge or consent." There were gasps and shocked whispers in the air. "My wife had an affair while I was away on deployment. She got pregnant and decided to give the baby away rather than face the consequences of her actions." "Stop it," Eliza cried. "This isn't how you wanted me to find out." Garrett cut her off. "I suppose you would have preferred I never knew the truth at all." He turned back to their stunned guests. "I have proof of everything. The adoption papers. The DNA tests. All of it. My wife, who is soon to be my wife, has been living a lie for 2 decades, and I've had to live with it." The weight of his words settled over the room, and chaos erupted. Friends turned to Eliza with looks of disgust and betrayal, while family members shouted questions and accusations. Garrett stood calmly watching as Eliza's world crumbled around her. Eliza's sister Sarah spoke up from the den. "Is this true, Eliza?" she asked. Her face showed shock and disappointment. Eliza was sobbing, and she could only nod. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry." Garrett let the scene unfold for a few more moments before speaking again. "I think it's best if everyone leaves now," he said. "Eliza and I have some things to discuss." As their guests left, many stopping to offer Garrett words of sympathy or shoot Eliza looks of disgust, Garrett felt a grim satisfaction. This was only the beginning of Eliza's reckoning. When the last guest had gone, Garrett turned to face his wife. Eliza stood in the middle of their dining room looking small and broken. She whispered, "Why? Why did you do it like this?" Garrett's laugh was cold and humorless. Why do you have the audacity to ask me why you stole 20 years of my life? Eliza, you let me believe our child was dead while you knew the truth all along. You don't get to ask why I made a mistake. Eliza pleaded. I was young and scared. Stop, Garrett cut her off. I don't want to hear your excuses. Excuses. I've heard enough of your lies to last a lifetime. He pulled an envelope from his pocket and tossed it onto the table. Divorce papers, he said flatly. I've already moved our assets. You'll find the details inside, but don't expect much. You've taken enough from me already. Eliza stared at the envelope, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. About Brielle, she asked softly. Garrett's eyes flashed dangerously. His voice was low and dangerous when he replied, Her name is Savannah. She's none of your concern anymore. You gave up that right 20 years ago. Please, Garrett, Eliza begged. We can work this out. Go to counseling. Start over. There is no starting over. You've ruined everything we had. Every memory and every moment of the past 20 years is tainted by your lies. There's nothing left to save. He took a deep breath, trying to calm down, and when he spoke again, his voice was cold and final. I want you out of the house by morning. Your lawyer can contact mine about the rest of the arrangements without waiting for. Garrett turned and walked out of the room, leaving Eliza alone with the ruins of the life she had built on lies. In the days that followed, Garrett watched with grim satisfaction as Eliza's life continued to unravel. Thanks to the evidence he had gathered, the divorce proceedings moved quickly. Their shared social circle turned their backs on Eliza in disgust at her deception. She was left feeling humiliated, isolated, and facing a future without the comfort and security she had grown used to. But Garrett wasn't finished yet. He still had one more piece of revenge to enact. Sitting at his desk, he pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write, Dear Savannah, my name is Garrett McKinley, and there's something you need to know. He carefully pinned the letter. He explained who he was and the circumstances of Savannah's birth. He felt a mix of emotions. He was cautious in his wording, omitting the full extent of Eliza's betrayal for now. This letter wasn't about punishing Eliza further. It was about reclaiming a piece of the life that had been stolen from him. He knew that building a relationship with Savannah would likely destroy Eliza even further. He thought about watching his daughter grow close to him, knowing the life she could have had with Garrett would be the final crushing blow to Eliza's soul as he sealed the envelope. Garrett allowed himself a small smile. He had lost 20 years, but now Eliza would suffer for a lifetime. Perhaps he could salvage something from the wreckage of his past. A relationship with a daughter he didn't know he had a daughter. The war wasn't over, but Garrett had won the first major battle and was prepared to see this through to the bitter end, no matter the cost. The crisp autumn air nipped at Garrett's face as he stood in the shadow of a large oak tree, his eyes fixed on the bustling college campus. Today was Savannah's graduation. He tracked her progress from afar, learning about her life. He'd been tracking her life for a while now, using carefully cultivated sources. He was here to witness a milestone, and he should have been part of it all along. As students in caps and gowns began to file out of the auditorium, Garrett's heart raced. Then he saw her, Savannah, no Brielle. He reminded himself. She emerged, her face beaming with pride as she clutched her diploma. For a moment, Garrett forgot to breathe. She was so much like Eliza, but he could see traces of Chase in her features. The sight of her stirred a complex mix of emotions, pride, anger, loss, and a desperate desire to connect. Brielle, a voice called out, and Garrett watched as an older couple embraced her. Her adoptive parents. He realized the family she'd known her whole life, as he observed their interaction. A conversation he'd had with Logan weeks earlier. Logan had asked, "Are you sure about this?" His face showed he was worried. If he reached out to Brielle, it could cause problems. Garrett's jaw had clenched. "I've lost 20 years," Logan said. "I won't lose any more." Logan sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I get it. I do. But think about it from her perspective. She's grown up with loving parents and a stable life. When he found out about all this, He gestured to the file spread between them. He could see that it could turn her world upside down. Garrett had scoffed. What about my world? Eliza's lies didn't just affect him. They affected Brielle too. She deserves to know the truth. And what exactly is your endgame here? Logan pressed. Revenge against Eliza is one thing, but dragging Brielle into it? I'm not dragging her into it. Garrett snapped. I'm going to give her a choice. The choice Eliza took from both of us. Logan held up his hands and surrendered. All right, it's your call. Just be careful, Garrett. This isn't just about punishing Eliza anymore. There's an innocent young woman in the middle of all this. Garrett refocused on the scene before him. Brielle was laughing and posing for photos. Photos with friends. She looked happy and carefree for a brief moment. Drew crept in. Was he doing the right thing? He remembered the years of lies and the grief he'd carried for a child who was never his to begin with. His resolve hardened. Belle deserved to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. As the crowd began to disperse, Garrett slipped away unnoticed. He wasn't ready to approach. She hadn't got round to reading his letter yet, but she would. She was sitting alone in a small, sparsely furnished apartment across town, staring at a photo of Brielle. She was crying as she traced the young woman's features with a trembling finger. She jumped as the doorbell rang. She wiped her eyes and went to answer it. She felt a bit down. When she saw who was standing on the other side, Chase, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Chase Winfield, who was older now but still handsome, pushed past her into the apartment. His face was a mask of barely contained fury. How could you, Eliza? He demanded, rounding on her. How could you keep this from me for all these years? Chase, I was trying to protect everyone. You call this protection? My marriage is in shambles, my reputation is ruined, and I find out I have a daughter I never knew about. How is any of this protection? I'm sorry, Eliza said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I never meant for any of this to happen. I was young and scared. Save it, Chase cut her off. I've heard enough of your excuses. I want to know about her and Brielle. Eliza's eyes widened in surprise. You know her name, Chase nodded grimly. Garrett made sure I knew everything, right down to where she goes to college. Garrett told you, Eliza gasped. But why would he? He's not just content with destroying your life. He's out to burn everything to the ground, including me and potentially Belle. Eliza sank into her chair. She sat down on a chair, her legs suddenly weak. What are we going to do? Chase ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. I don't know, but we need to figure it out fast for Belle's sake, if nothing else. As they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, neither could have imagined the storm that was about to break over all their lives. Brielle Hastings sat cross. Brielle sat on her bed, staring at the letter in her hands. She'd read it a dozen times already, but her adoptive mom called from the doorway. Belle looked up, forcing a smile. Yeah, Mom, just processing, she replied. Mrs. Hastings stepped into the room, concern etched on her face. Do you want to talk about it for a moment? Brielle considered sharing the contents of the letter, but how could she explain something she barely? Instead, she shook her head. Not yet. I think I need some time to figure things out first. Her mom nodded, understanding in her eyes. Okay, but remember your father and I are here for you, no matter what. As Mrs. Hastings left the room, Brielle turned back to the letter. The words seemed to jump off the page. I know this will come as a shock, but I believe you deserve to know the truth. Your biological mother's name is Eliza McKinley. She was married to me when you were. Brielle's mind was racing. She'd always known she was adopted, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. A married woman giving her up for adoption. A man who thought he was her father for 20 years, only to discover it was all a lie. And now, this man, Garrett McKinley, wanted to meet her. Brielle was shaking hands as she reached for her phone. She needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to her. Garrett's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. He looked up from his screen, His heart started racing when he saw the message. This is Brielle Hastings. I got your letter. I think we need to talk. Garrett paused. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. The culmination of months of planning and years of pent-up anger. But now that it was here, he felt a flicker of uncertainty. He took a deep breath. P.M. The coffee shop on Main Street. Garrett confirmed the meeting, feeling a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Tomorrow he would finally come face to face with the young woman at the center of this web of lies. The next day, Garrett arrived at the coffee shop early, choosing a table in the corner where he could see the door. His palms were sweaty and his heart was racing. He'd faced down enemy combatants with less nervousness than he felt now. At precisely 2 p.m., the door opened and Brielle walked in. Garrett's breath caught in his throat. Seeing her up close, he noticed the resemblance to Eliza was even more striking. Brielle's eyes scanned the room, landing on Garrett. Recognition flashed across her face, and she made her way over to Mr. McKinley. She asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her eyes. Garrett stood, offering his hand. Please call me Garrett. It's good to meet you, Brielle. They sat in silence for a moment before Brielle spoke. I have so many questions, she said. I don't even know where to start. Garrett nodded. I understand. I promise to answer everything as honestly as I can. He paused for a moment, then asked, What would you like to know? Brielle took a deep breath. Why now, after all these years, why reach out to me now? Garrett's jaw clenched because I only found out the truth recently myself. You said in your letter that you're not my biological father. For her, he leaned forward, his eyes intense. For 20 years I believed you were my daughter. I mourned you. Brielle, Eliza told me you had died before you were born. Brielle's eyes widened in shock. She said, But why would she? To cover up her affair. Garrett said, his voice hard. He was trying to hide the fact that she got pregnant by another man while I was deployed overseas. Brielle sat back, stunned. This is a lot to take in. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you, but I thought you deserved to know the truth. My biological father is Chase Winfield. He was a friend of ours back then. With this new information, her entire identity, and everything she thought she knew about her origins was being rewritten. What do you want from me? She asked suddenly. They carried on chatting, and neither of them noticed the figure watching them from across the street. Eliza was frozen, unable to tear her eyes away from the scene in the coffee shop. Garrett and Brielle were sitting together, talking. The daughter she'd given up and the husband she'd betrayed were united by the very lie she told to keep them apart. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She was about to leave when she heard Chase's voice behind her. His expression was serious, and he made her jump. She turned to find him standing beside her. What are you doing here? She hissed. Chase's eyes were fixed on the coffee shop. He looked like he was trying to figure out how to fix this mess. How can we possibly fix this? Eliza laughed bitterly. I don't know, Chase admitted. We have to try for her sake, if nothing else. They watched in silence as Garrett and Belle continued their conversation, the weight of their choices pressing down on them like a physical force over the next few weeks. Brielle's world shifted on its axis. She met with Chase, had long, painful conversations with her adoptive parents, and tried to reconcile the life she'd known with the truth. She found that Garrett was always there for her. He never pushed her to do anything, but he was always there when she needed to talk or ask questions. One evening, as they were walking through a park near Belle's campus, she turned to him and said, I've been thinking. She said it hesitantly. I've been thinking about changing my name to Savannah. Garrett stopped short, surprised, and said, Are you sure? You don't have to do that for me, Brielle. She shook her head. It's not for you, well, not entirely. It's the name you and Eliza chose for me. It's the name I would have had if things had been different. I think I'd like to reclaim it. Garrett felt a lump form in his throat. I'd be honored, but what about your parents? Your adoptive parents. I mean Savannah. That's who she was now. She smiled softly, And he realized that she understood that it didn't change who they were to her, but that this felt right. As they continued walking, Garrett felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had finally got his revenge against Eliza. She had lost everything, including the daughter she'd given away. But more than that, he had gained something he never thought he'd have a chance to know: the child. He'd been mourning for so long, but months later, Garrett found himself at the back of a small auditorium watching Savannah give a presentation for her master's thesis. He felt a surge of pride as she confidently answered questions from her professors. As the presentation ended and people began to file out, Garrett noticed two figures lingering near the back. He saw Eliza and Chase, who hadn't approached. Savannah respected the boundaries she'd set, but their presence was a reminder of the complex web of relationships that had brought them all to this point. Savannah made her way through the crowd, her face lighting up when she saw Garrett. "You made it!" she exclaimed, hugging him tightly. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world." Garrett replied, returning the embrace, as they pulled apart. Ken nodded towards Eliza and Chase. They came too. Savannah's expression grew serious as she looked over her shoulder at her biological parents. "I know," she said softly. "I'm glad they did." Garrett raised an eyebrow. "Are you ready to talk to them?" Savannah took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. "I think so. Will you come with me?" Garrett nodded and placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. "Shoulder, of course, whatever you need." They made their way towards Eliza and Chase. Garrett thought about the journey that had brought them here. The pain, the betrayal, the lies, all of it had led to this moment. He would never forgive Eliza for what she'd done, but he found that his anger had been tempered by something unexpected: gratitude. Gratitude for the chance to know Savannah. To be a part of her life in a way he never thought possible. He was grateful for her strength in facing her complicated origins head-on. Despite everything, he was grateful for the twists of fate that had brought them to this point. As Savannah began to speak with Eliza and Chase, Garrett stood back, watching. The future was uncertain, the relationships between them all still fragile. It was a complex situation, but for the first time in years, Garrett felt hope. It wasn't for reconciliation or forgiveness, as some betrayals were too deep for that. It was for something new. A future where the truth, painful as it was, could pave the way for healing and growth. As he watched Savannah navigate this difficult conversation with grace and strength, Garrett knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Together, they'd uncovered the buried secrets and exposed the lies to the light. Now it was time to build something new on the ashes of the past. The war was over, and while the cost had been high, Garrett found that victory tasted different than he'd imagined. It wasn't the bitter satisfaction of revenge. It was the bittersweet hope of a new beginning. And that he realized was a victory worth having.